Professor Haider Khan is a John Evans Professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and he's published many books and articles on many human rights topics in Bangladesh, but also on economics and humanities as well. And he's a poet too. And we're very lucky to have him today to talk about global human rights, human sciences, and humanities. So with no further ado, Dr. Khan, I'll let you have your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Esparza. Luis and I have been friends for a long time, and I am very interested in the kind of work that he and his friends are doing, very important work on social movements. And I think we absolutely need more of that kind of work. So I'm really happy to do this. Is virtual, but it's better than not seeing anybody at all. And I hope that in the future I can meet especially those who are in South America, who are participating from Latin America, and especially South America. I can meet at least some of them. So I have titled this talk, Global Human Rights, Human Sciences, and Humanities, with a subtitle, Development as Freedom. As many of you might know, Professor Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for many significant pieces of work that he had done. But I think this idea of development as freedom, developing this in concrete details, probably is the crowning achievement of a very creative and still creative life, I might add. And I have been very fortunate to learn from him in so many ways. I could never repay my debt to teachers like him and my other teachers whom I would mention. But immediately, let me actually engage in a kind of self-deconstruction, including the deconstruction of the title. Because human rights, as it is used nowadays, especially politically used, is kind of a construction that occurred in what we sometimes called the West. I really don't think this kind of West-East dichotomy is a very productive way, although it could be useful at times. I think when we are talking about politics of global North, global South, etc., and the relations between the global North and global South, sometimes using the word West might help, although if you use it along with the global North, it might introduce some confusion in that way as well. So having just made ourselves aware of the pitfalls of these, sometimes I may still have to use this. So that's why the warning. Now, my idea of deconstruction also is somewhat different. It's not Derridian, because I have been known to be a critique of Derrida in particular. And if people are interested, I will explain that. But what I really want to do during this talk, methodologically, and it will be implicit, sometimes perhaps more explicit than implicit, you will see as we go along. I would call it a modified post-colonial and Foucaultian genealogical approach, but Foucault itself presents various problems for us as well, for people from the global South in particular. But the genealogical approach, which in modern West again comes or is associated with Nietzsche, but actually predates Nietzsche both in the so-called West and certainly in the rest of the world, including the indigenous traditions in various parts of the world, including the Americas. Let me just say this much at the beginning, and we can come back to it human rights and Renaissance humanism is, I think, an important development, especially Pico della Mirandola's Oratio de Hominis Dignitate, where he actually introduced, among other things, the interesting construction in Italian. It is uomo. Maybe uomo means man, but just like hominis, but we would extend the meaning to include women and in between genders as well. So it's really expanding the capacities of human beings. That's the good part of it. The bad part of it is that with later development of imperialism, or already some imperialism has developed with respect to Spain and Portugal in the New World, so-called, it became, or it was co-opted into the service of this kind of so-called superior civilization. But like everything else, that construction also has a history, but we need to deconstruct that in the sense of preserving some part, but also overcoming other inaccurate, weak, or destructive part. So that's basically, in a nutshell, my idea of deconstruction. It doesn't mean that you destroy everything. In fact, that meaning is not so far from Heidegger's distinction between destruction and deconstruction, from which Derrida actually borrows. Now, I also want to quickly add methodologically that I practice a kind of critical postmodern posthumanism as opposed to cynical postmodernism. Much of the postmodernism, or what goes in the name of postmodernism in the West, and people in the rest of the world, especially academics, who borrow that term without quite going through it critically and making it their own, for purposes that actually I would support, purposes of liberation, they simply parrot this cynical postmodernism, which has a lot to do with late capitalism and consumerist culture, and a kind of flattening out of all human experience in a cynical way that makes it sound very clever in terms of discourse, but actually, when you examine it closely, it turns out to be very shallow, if not destructive, and often it is destructive. And we do need to create or contribute to this project of posthumanism in a positive sense, where we include all beings. So having said that, let me now methodologically go to the positive part of my own approach, which I have decided to call a dialogical postmodern approach. It's a dialogical approach for those who are familiar with Freire, liberation theology, which certainly have developed in Latin America and spread from there to much of the rest of the world. But actually, the beginnings of these can be found in African and Asian, as well as indigenous knowledge systems in the Americas in particular, which has to do a lot with forms of storytelling, forms of dialogical storytelling. The great Indian epic Mahabharata actually starts in this vein of dialogical storytelling. And Ranjit Guha, one of the founders of subaltern studies in history, gave 3 lectures at Columbia University, and then they were later published as a book. And I wrote a review of that book for the Journal of the Asian Studies Association, which can be found. But there I discussed this kind of dialogical approach to history, which was the subject of Guha, and a critique of Hegel's theory of history in passing. But the really important part I want to emphasize is the signature of indigenous knowledge system and practices in comprehensive construction of rights for all beings, a truly concrete universal for our times. As Dipesh Chakravarty, in his very famous book, points out, the European modernism or modernity really is provincial. It's not truly universal. The task of creating a truly concrete universal is something that we have to face up to, all the citizens of this planet, and include all beings, not just human beings. So we can come back to this and discuss that ontologically and epistemologically in more detail if people are interested. But let me go to the outline. The starting point for this discussion will be a robust post-World War II. And here there are three economists, and they get increasingly broader as you proceed. Keynes, I think everybody knows about Keynes from Cambridge, UK. Kalecki, who is less known, and that's why my friend Heikki Petomäki, Professor Heikki Petomäki from University of Finland in Helsinki, and I wrote in the particular context of global finance about Kalecki. And then Myrdal, who is a Nobel Prize winner, but because his economics is more like sociology, many economists don't even know his name anymore. But he's truly a great thinker. And I think people should know more about him. And it creates a kind of robust liberalism, I would say, which is now remarkable by its absence. Neoliberalism has nothing to do with this kind of robust liberalism, or very little to do with this robust liberalism. And social democracy is, in a good sense, I would say, it has its dark side as well, but social democracy embodies institutionally in many ways the better part of this kind of socially oriented liberalism and democratic practices. But there are, as I have already alluded, there are contradictions in this thinking, because it doesn't think carefully enough about who really controls the state, in whose interest policies are really made ultimately, and in times of crisis, what happens, which class actually gains the upper hand, and how. And Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if we look at it in its historical context, actually comes at a moment in the history of imperialism and modern capitalism in Europe and the settler states, let's call them, outside of Europe, as well as the dominated part of the world, which was always in the majority in terms of population and even area. And there was, however flawed, a socialist bloc at that time, although they were not really included in the conversation. But many others were. There were people from India, and the Chinese representative was really at that time in China, I suppose, but soon Chiang Kai-shek would run, and they would have Taiwan only. But the representative from, main representative from China actually was a very articulate philosopher. And so was the woman from India, and I will have more to say about her soon. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights, again, is a pivotal document in the sense that it really represents a kind of emergence from tremendous bloody mayhem that fundamentally was caused by inner contradictions of advanced capitalism in Europe and other parts of the world, with enough people recognizing that we have to have a new kind of world order. And that is the more positive part of the UN Charter, and also positive side of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there were so many ambiguities, compromises, elisions that the document is at best an imperfect one, and it's a declaration of intentions and aspirations rather than of reality. So we should remember that. I will present for our purpose, because after all, the purpose of my talk is to try to motivate people, if not inspire them, to practice and advance this more comprehensive idea of rights for all in our time. So I will present a modified 21st century, what I call social capabilities approach, echoing sense development as freedom idea via what he calls capabilities, and we will explore that a little more. And then I will conclude not with too many solutions, because we have to figure the solutions out or even define the problems properly together. But I will point to some areas in which we need to focus. Let me just go to the next slide now. Okay, so we have to really understand the non-European beginnings. For example, in China and India, Kautilya wrote his Arthashastra in 4th century BC, although literal translation is probably something like the science of wealth. It actually is much more comprehensive and is well worth studying. Confucius and Mencius, the Buddhist democratic city-state governance in India, those are important markers, and I've discussed some of them in my other works. I also wanted to point out the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. They are not the same documents, by the way. Like all written documents, there are politics behind all these compilations of all versions of Bibles, as well as the Quran in Islam, and I'm sure that applies to written texts in many other traditions as well. I want to mention Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, which are actually very important and deep books. And Martha Nussbaum, for example, points out that capabilities can be given a foundation by going back to Aristotle. And I half agree with her. It's definitely useful, but Aristotle lived in a different time from ours. Even Hegel and Marx lived in different times than ours, although much closer to our time. So we have to include the contradictions in all these thinkers and go forward to address problems that are specific to our time. The great Arab historian, philosopher, thinker, Al-Farabi, falsafa, which is the Arabic word for philosophy, and Madaniya is, of course, Medina is a city in modern Saudi Arabia, but it actually means city. The kind of philosophy of city, you might call it, you already see that the political evolution is going in a certain direction. And then the great Jewish thinker Maimonides and his Mishneh Torah, the first written codification in a really compendious form of Jewish laws, and they include many issues that we would call human rights issues today. Even a deeper document is Ibn Arabi's Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which literally means the Meccan openings. It's a great work of logic and mysticism together. Bertrand Russell wrote a very moving essay, at least I was very moved when I first read it as a teenager, called Logic and Mysticism, or maybe Mysticism and Logic, where he basically extols logic in a very mystical way at the end. Very, very moving, actually, paean to logic, maybe the best ever written by anyone. But Ibn Arabi, long before Russell or anyone else, does the same job in an even more eloquent way. I have given 2 lectures on Ibn Arabi, and I think they're online, so people who are interested can look up. Ibn Khaldun is now receiving belated recognition for his great work Muqaddimah and his sociology. Sociologists, I think, know more about Ibn Khaldun than economists. Most economists have no idea, especially the economists from from South who should know much more. There are exceptions, by the way. My friend Professor Abul Barkat in Dhaka, Bangladesh, has mentioned Ibn Khaldun in his book, which I think can be roughly translated as The Poverty of Philosophy of Economics. Ibn Battuta was a great traveler, and he came all the way to Bengal, which is Bengal, part of which is Bangladesh now, in 14th century of current era. And in his descriptions, he has an implicit kind of critique of some things, including slavery, I would say, and ambiguous as it is, his writings, writings of traveler in the form of travelogue. He touches on very important issues of economic right and political right. If we move back to Europe, the laws of Burgos, December 27, 1512, directly relate to the New World, so-called, because there were, as many scholars have pointed out, and as many of you know, real contradictions in Catholic thought that emerged from contradictions in the real world. But it wasn't just all heartless, greedy, colonialism, although much of it was, but thoughtful people also saw the injustice, the naked injustice of it and the brutality of it, and tried to think, and this was one attempt to mitigate that, one could say. Not very successful, I must hasten to add. But then we have the great European revolutions of modernity and socialism, and they also are contradictory, like everything else. And in the New World, it is very obvious that the great French Revolution, which inspired people like Toussaint Louverture and the Haitians to carry on the first great revolution, modern revolution, I would say, on the Western Hemisphere. The French revolutionaries really couldn't bring themselves to support it. In fact, they tried to suppress it, and racism played its role there in a very vicious way, among other things. My great mentor, the poet and revolutionary from Martinique, the great poet Aimé Césaire, has depicted this in many of his plays and his writings and his poems, especially his first book of poetry that he published after coming back from Paris after his education back to Martinique. So I would just say that in the contradictions of these revolutions, especially a French Revolution, we also had a more liberatory side as well, and we should not ignore that, but we should not make it the only focus of study of these revolutions and study of modernity, because that has caused a lot of harm, especially in the global South. And today, even today, it's causing a great deal of harm when we cannot think of anything beyond NGOs funded by the West to carry on development in those countries, which is not to say that NGOs don't have a positive role to play in some circumstances. I'm not a dogmatic person in that sense. On the other hand, we need to be much more critical of NGOs and look much more closely at what they really do and what political purposes they serve than most people seem to be willing. In the same way, socialism was a highly contradictory construct and generated many contradictions of its own in practice. I mean here the state-centric socialism, which is not the only kind of socialism one can think of, but coming out of the great political revolutions in the West, that became the dominant way of thinking. And we have to learn from the limitations of that kind of thinking as well. Let me now quickly touch upon some of the post-UDHR documents. We have the International Bill of Human Rights. We have the Convention on Civil and Political Right. We have the Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Right. We have the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, just to mention a few of them. And then important to note that the Iraqi diplomat, a woman diplomat, Bidia Afwan, insisted on recognizing gender equality. And Pakistani diplomat Shaista Ikramullah offered very cogent arguments for recognizing women's rights long before white feminism started making these issues. And of course, their contribution has to be recognized as well. We have now also this comprehensive elimination of discrimination against women. We have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we have the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. So there have been progress, at least on paper, but also to the extent some people have been willing to practice them, and social movements, and this is the most important part, I think, of my talk, developed, which carried on some of these ideas in practice and deepened them through practice. And I think my friend, Professor Esparza, his great work on Colombia and other parts of the world, other movements, they actually show how this has happened and how this can happen even better. Let me just do a little bit more on the history, especially of the non-Western part of human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, who I think was much more radical than FDR, and especially her friends, her female friends, who are more radical than even she was. In her memoir, she actually mentions in a very gentle, humorous way some of the background stories that resulted in this document finally. And I mentioned the Chinese delegate, or leader of the Chinese delegates, Dr. Chang, and Mrs. Roosevelt tells us, Dr. Chang was a pluralist. The declaration, he said, should reflect more than simply Western ideas. His remark was really directed at Dr. Malik, from whom it drew a prompt retort as he expounded at some length the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. At one point, Dr. Chang suggested that the Secretariat might well spend a few months studying the fundamentals of Confucianism. Well, I think that would have been a good idea, but they didn't. And then she mentions Hansa Mehta, who was the most prominent woman delegate actually in this background meetings. And she was a doctor actually, she was a physician. Among her many contributions, Hansa Mehta from India was responsible for changing the language of UDHR from all men are created equal, which is an echo from the American Declaration of Independence, to all human beings are created equal. Of course, in post-human construction, we have to go beyond human beings as well, as I alluded right at the beginning. Let me now quickly mention that the kind of embedded liberalism, as Ruggie had called it, but I would say it's actually, it needs to be articulated better than just calling it embedded liberalism. It's a strong type of liberalism that is not just 19th century classical liberalism, but at least understand some of the crises of capitalism as it evolved, and try to do something about it, as well as advance human freedoms in a positive sense. For example, the Atlantic Charter for Freedoms, etc. So we can ask the question, what are the prospects for a society that cherishes a liberalism built on, actually, I call it the harm principle, but actually it's no harm principle, a society that daily confronts the opposing pool of jungle and zoo. I think this is a good metaphor to remember. We do live in both jungle and zoo. We face perils clearly at every turn, and it continues to be the human responsibility to dedicate our political resources to reducing them. And this is one way I believe that politics can be people-oriented and effective under some circumstances, not always, but under appropriate circumstances, some of which we have to create by ourselves. Others are objective developments independent of our will. So let me offer quickly a theoretical pathway. We actually need to create a political ethical community, a kind of global Sittlichkeit for enhancing human capabilities. And these capabilities can flourish only when all are allowed to participate in its construction. It's not something that has to be done just by the elites. Second, reduce harms and increase social capabilities, the capabilities for people to live a life of positive freedoms and develop their human potentials. But it has to be also addressed to non-human beings on our planet as well. Social individuality must be respected in a democratic socialist political economy. So I don't have time to unpack all this, but during the Q&A, I'll be happy to do so. I have developed, by kind of constantly thinking about these things, a kind of capsule term for things that I want to say. And I have several articles by now that are available, some online that I think people can go to. I call it a socially embedded intersectional capabilities approach. So in abbreviation, it is SEICA, S-E-I-C-A. So it's fundamentally based on sociality and social relations. And politics and economics, more broadly culture, they're all rooted in social relations. So understanding social relations is the first order of business for social scientists, or those who call themselves social scientists, or even more properly human scientists. That's why I've used the word human science, which we can trace back to Hume, and it's a different Hume when you go back to these kind of reflections. And since then, especially in continental Europe, thinkers, including Catholic thinkers, have developed this quite rigorously. But we also have to grasp the role of uneven development and imperialism. Many people in North America shy away, many social scientists, that is, from looking at these things. I think that's just a cop-out, if not opportunistic. So we need to directly address it and face the problems of imperialism head-on, face the problems of uneven development head-on. And we need, this is the most important part, I think, although they are all interconnected, local and interconnected global movements from below. From below, I think that is really the important thing. But we face problems immediately of practice. One is hypocrisy, which of course we find, especially in media, but in academia as well, this self-righteousness by people who get mesmerized by their fine phrases and completely ignore the contradictions and what they are really doing with their lives. We also have now added to these problems what I would call humanitarian imperialism. In fact, Jean Primand, the Belgian human rights activist, has written a book on this. It became evident, especially during the unipolar moment in 1990s, and it goes on even today. People who get big grants for doing work on human rights quite often end up supporting humanitarian imperialism in the project, which they define as being humanitarian only. They completely ignore the imperialism part of this. We have today neoliberal challenges to UDHR. People in Latin America are very aware of that. They are the ones who actually defined and elaborated on the term neoliberal. But we also face now neo-fascist challenges to UDHR because capitalism is facing crisis. Increasingly, this deepening crisis globally cannot be solved by capitalism as we know, that is neoliberalism today, with some elements of social democracy that still survive. I think that like in 1930s, history does not repeat itself, I want to immediately add, but it does rhyme, as Mark Twain pointed out. We would find some parallels between the crisis, global crisis of capitalism, and the rise of various kinds of neo-fascism in various parts of the world. A few years ago, I probably would have to spend time convincing people on that, but now you can see them happening right in front of your own very eyes, and especially for young people, I think one doesn't have to spend too much time convincing them. One has to tell them or participate with them in anti-fascist struggles. But let me spend a little more time on humanitarian imperialism, because as I said, it still goes on. And just to convince people, if people need convincing, that this is not my imagination, Michael Ignatieff and Thomas Friedman both are very prominent quote liberals, unquote. In fact, Ignatieff is very much a self-declared liberal, and so is Friedman, really, although Friedman is more shallow than Ignatieff. But Ignatieff says, America's empire is not like empires of times past, a global hegemony whose grace notes are free markets, human rights, and democracy enforced by the most awesome military power the world has ever known. Of course, now we are finding out that it's not so awesome after all. But Friedman, who is not as good a writer as Ignatieff, or not as deep either, the hidden feast that keeps the world safe is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. There you have it. So here's Noam Chomsky, an honest scholar, if there ever was one. He faces this in a very straightforward way, as is typical for him. The apologists for imperial power have said the same thing. You can go back to John Stuart Mill, one of the most outstanding, defended the British Empire in very much the same words. Mill wrote the classic essay on humanitarian intervention. Britain is unique in the world. Other countries have crass motives and seek gains, but the British act only for the benefit of others. So it's really an old theme now embraced by the top imperialist of the world, the United States. Now, Jean Brimont, I mentioned his name before. His book is well worth reading. It is still very, very topical. It was published in French, I think, first in 2006. People who have been appealing to human rights for 30 years in order to flatter the American superpower, risk finding themselves, perhaps against their will, the objective. In any case, the question of soft landing after the passing of post-World War II US hegemony is the major problem of our time, as well as the principal challenge that needs to be met by progressive peace or global justice movements. My addition to this is, have we thought about this problem deeply enough in the last 18 years? I don't think we have. So let's move towards progress. It may be triumph of hope over experience, but I think hope is really, really important. And in that, I think I echo St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians in all three items that he lists there, including love, which he thinks, and I think rightly so, is the most important of all. So we have to move towards a shallow universalism, or what Dipesh Chakraborty calls provincialism. And we have to also move beyond shallow relativism, which is shallow and in fact cheap, because liberals just say, oh yeah, we agree that we should tolerate everyone, but they don't know anything about others. And they don't want to know anything about others because they think what they have is so superior to what the others have. But because they are good liberals, they are not going to say it. They will just say, oh, we respect everybody, but there is no need to know everybody. But as Erich Fromm points out in his little book on love, The Art of Loving, if you really love someone and respect those person, you also want to know more and more about them every day. So we need better historical research cross-culturally and better theories based on the best scientific evidence and better theory-based empirical work. Now, there may not be too many economists in the audience, so I will go over the next few slides very quickly. We need to understand causality in complex systems, and we need to do more field work. So sociologists usually are much more complexity of the real world and complexity of causality in the real world. We also need to, I think, do more work and become more aware of what we might call natural experiments in history. If we study history deeply and widely and carefully, we will find that there are all these natural experiments that have occurred.
Remember some places in the US, and for me as a Brazilian researcher and also work for the police station, a human rights police station in Brazil. And for me, I was so shocked with the US system because the university, they cannot talk with the government and with the institutions, with the NGO. And as you presented in here, we have to thinking about a global issue together. And here in Brazil, I work for the state, not for the government, as a police chief. And also, I'm here at the university to get more knowledge, to improve my practice way, and also my thoughts and thinking about social policies and the police as well, to improve them and to talk with the civil society. I try to work together, but in the US, during my visit, I just visited NGO separately than the government, and I couldn't understand. Another thing, you said about the UN declaration, and I visited Pensacola in Florida, and there I find out they keep 6-year-old children in the prison. And for me, it's like a shock. And I try to understand, okay, the Britain Empire, the US Empire, they tell about everyone about, okay, let's preserve their human rights, and they cannot do it inside the house. And my question is about how you see this big challenge in North America and also Europe and South America and Africa to get together the three worlds, the NGO, the government, and also especially the academic. I think I belong to academic, and we live, it's like in a cloud building, and we have to talk and act, local and global. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. These are very important questions, especially from a practitioner's point of view, but also they raise quite difficult theoretical issues as well. Let me just start on the practice side. I think the relationship between the state, the civil society organizations, especially NGOs, and people who are affected, I think these are very important. And one, if you read, for example, you spoke about children and women. If you look at those documents on human rights, you find that they're actually fairly detailed, especially the one on Convention of Rights of Children and the additional protocols. Especially the additional protocols, I think, are very specific and very detailed. I think the problem in practice arises because of different motivations and different modus operandi that these organizations have, both on the state side, which is unfortunately very bureaucratic in the Weberian sense, really. And on the civil society side, as I said, there are varieties of NGOs. And there are different motivations, both of the donors. Most of them are donor funded, although there are some NGOs that have developed from grassroots levels in many countries. I do not want to ignore them because I think they will have an important role to play in the future. So I am generally, in that sense, supportive of NGOs, especially those that have domestic roots and run by activists and wise people connected with their own people and their problems, because many of them do come from similar backgrounds themselves. And there is no questioning their sincerity and their efficiency also in serving. The larger NGOs funded by the global north, in the Americas, the North Americans, basically, US and Canada in particular, they present more complicated problem because, I have done a lot of field work myself, and there are many good people there. Some of them are my students, so they are good people. On the other hand, when you get into the administrative mechanisms and the politics behind them, you find that they are run from Washington or Ottawa. People go through the motions of consulting. But if you are a dissident in some ways, you are soon made aware of the fact of where the money comes from. And then you have the kind of co-optation of people. And the larger the organization, sociologists know this much better than economists, the more complicated the bureaucracy becomes. And large NGOs are no exceptions to this rule. Then it becomes a career path to many people. And that presents its own difficulties, I think. People do need career in monetary economists because they have to, most of them, raise a family, put food on the table, have a roof on their head. These are parts of Universal Economic Rights Declaration as well. So we do have a very complicated problem which we cannot solve in one stroke. But I think the most promising direction would be to start from the ground above, build up alternative NGOs, build up alternative practices. In many ways, Latin American thinkers have played a pioneering role, I think, in these areas. There's a lot to learn from their ideas, from their practices, and from the movements like the ones that Professor Esparza and others have studied and are studying. So those are very, very important. But also, I think it is important to look at the state apparatus and the way to reform some of the practices. They have limits, but also to work towards a larger goal of more fundamental change in the state apparatus and relationship between the state and the society, and then even more broadly, the relationship between states and societies in the global south and states and societies in the global north, so that we can build a true world social, economic and political forum for the people, not for the people in Davos. I think this is very important. Theoretically, people have done, of course, some work in human rights field. I myself have used the approach that I described. You can find a paper I did for the ASEAN region. It's online. Very long paper, but there I also explain this socially embedded intersectional capabilities approach, especially for women and minorities. And then in the Denver International Journal of Law, I have published an article specifically addressed to women's rights and how to think about them. And the bottom line is that there is no alternative in terms of practice and development of more useful theory than grassroots movements from below. For rights. I think that's the most important takeaway from anything I have to say on this. And that means that people themselves have to become agents of change and agents of ideas and agents of dissemination of those ideas and better practices. But your question is so deep and so rich. I'm sorry that we only have limited time, but I'm glad that we got started. I hope we can have more dialogues.
Thank you, Professor Khan, about that. I know that we're over time, so I don't want to take up more of your time. Do you have maybe time for one more question? You have to run. Did you hear that?
I couldn't hear the last part clearly.
Okay. I know that we're over time, so I don't want to keep you, much longer. Do you have time for maybe one more question, or should we?
Sure. No, if you have more than one question, that's fine too. I think I'm really interested in dialogue.
Okay. Anyone else have a question? Okay. If not, I'll just ask a quick question, or I'll conclude this with just saying that I appreciate especially the non-European threads of the origins of the UDHR that you presented, because that's something that is elusive even for me. When I introduced the UDHR here in this class, I mostly focused on the European threads of it. Certainly, the classical Western literature, Aristotle, etc., but also the rights of man and the Declaration, the U.S. Declaration. Political developments in especially England, but not so much these other non-Western contributions. Only some of them. And so I really appreciated that about your talk. And there are contributions not just to the UDHR, but also to the great conversation in general. In this class, one thing that we've been debating I'm an advocate for nonviolent approaches to change, and we read for today Gandhi. But some people don't, are maybe less patient with nonviolence, as you are aware. And some of my students maybe have questions about that. And so, how would you address that? Approach that topic?
Okay, well, that of course deserves a whole lecture or maybe a series of lectures. But I'm glad that we have a chance to get started again. I think it is fairly at the normative level, uncontroversial to say that if we can accomplish our goal non-violently, that is much to be preferred to any kind of violence. Looking at history, and without, for the moment, passing value judgments, we have to recognize that the process of change is a dialectics of violence and non-violence. I think for people who are genuinely interested in human progress, especially in these areas, it's a mistake to adopt violence as the primary goal, even on practical ground. I don't completely agree with the literature that purports through empirical analysis to show that nonviolent movements succeed 90% of the times. All these numbers, I think, are not really justified methodologically, but conceptually, I think we can argue that a genuinely progressive movement for better rights for everyone, including humans, must start with a commitment to nonviolence. And to that extent, Tolstoy and Gandhi, and even before then, Jesus, I think, as he has come down, and as even liberation theologists, theologians who have expounded on these aspects, and Christology tell us nonviolence is important to defend on many different levels, and I've only distinguished a few levels. By the way, I have a lecture that's online where I think the title is Values and Violence, where I discuss these more, especially in what was then contemporary context, former Yugoslavia and the violence there. I think that coming back to this tradition of nonviolence and understanding it is very important. In the Western Hemisphere, of course, Henry David Thoreau is celebrated for his approach of civil disobedience. And I think that's what I would focus on, civil disobedience. And at least in the beginning, and for as long as it is possible, to do this non-violently. But at the same time, as I was having a discussion just yesterday with a friend at Duke University, that people do have the right to defend themselves. In fact, that goes into the very fundamental Declaration of Human Rights of physical safety and security. Now, how you should defend yourself is an important question. Gandhi, for example, said in the 1940s during the Second World War, that if the Nazis came to bomb, he would just go outside and sacrifice himself. And Gandhi was pretty sincere in his beliefs. One cannot question his convictions. But given the history of Nazism and fascism in general, I think we have to be a little more cautious and develop a more dialectical approach to fighting fascism. So there are those issues involved, but nonviolence is something that is so valuable at so many levels, especially in our personal lives. You can see the results of nonviolence as you progress in this path towards nonviolence every day in your own life. So I think it is something that one has to defend, one has to practice, more importantly, every day. And even in our thinking, in our feeling, the qualities that make us truly human and spiritual beings. I think practice of nonviolence is very, very fundamental.
Great. Well, Dr. Khan, thank you for a fascinating talk. Again, I've been to several of your talks, and they're always, I always take a couple of pages of notes and a couple of weeks of research to follow up on what it is that you say, and this is no exception to that. I'm sure that the students also appreciated hearing this, and yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you all. As I said, it's really the beginning of a dialogue, so I am easily reachable by email and other means. We have to thank modern technology for these things, certainly. So please feel free to contact me. Feel free to contact me directly or through Professor Esparza. And I thank those who also participated remotely. If they have any questions, they are welcome to send them to me and to Professor Esparza as well. And thank you all very much.